Before we start, just a word about that ominous last line in the gospel. And those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. All of us who at some point do evil need to remember that the Christ who is making that judgment is the one who said on the cross, "Father, forgive them." And Peter, who betrayed him, became the leader of the early church. Don't give up hope. Please be seated. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. William Shakespeare, Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 5. At the dawn of the space race, a Russian cosmonaut orbited the Earth a number of times, came back and announced that he'd been to the heavens and there was no God there. For him, proof that God did not exist. It doesn't work that way. There are no ways to scientifically prove the existence of God or the presence of the Spirit. Yet there are hints. Frederick Buechner wrote about one such hint. He's probably my favorite preacher and one of my favorite authors, but this was a real-life event that he was writing about. A year or so ago, a friend of mine died. One morning in his 68th year, he simply didn't wake up. It was, Buechner writes, about as easy a way as he could possibly have done it. But it wasn't easy for those of us left behind. It gave us no chance to start getting used to the idea or to say goodbye. 2 months later, Buechner and his wife visited the widow. That night, he said, I dreamed he was standing there in the dark guest room where we were asleep, looking very much himself, in the navy blue jersey and white slacks he often wore. I told him how much we missed him and how glad I was to see him again. He acknowledged that somehow. And I said, "Are you really there, Dudley?" His answer was that he was there. "Can you prove it?" I said. "Of course," he said. Then he plucked a strand of wool from his jersey and tossed it to me. Next morning over breakfast, Buechner was talking to his wife and the widow, and he told them about the dream. I'd hardly finished when my wife spoke. She said that she'd seen the strand on the carpet as she was getting dressed, and she was sure it hadn't been there the night before. I rushed upstairs to see for myself, and there it was, a little tangle of navy blue wool. Coincidence? Wish fulfillment? Funky dream on an upset stomach? An old, overlooked blue thread? Or is it possible, Buechner asked, was this a glimpse of a world beyond what our senses confirm and our measurements measure? Buechner admits he himself isn't sure. But perhaps it is a hint of some life beyond our finite life. Perhaps that strand is a gift from God. Or maybe it's nothing at all. Maybe it was a fluke. But if it was a fluke, there are a lot of flukes in this life. Mystics of every major religion testify to visions and dreams of great power and love. You don't know how many people came to me over my decades of being a pastor to say, "Pastor, I've never told anyone else, but da-da-da-da-da." I don't want people to think I'm crazy. Now, all of that might not be enough for our Russian cosmonaut friend, but most days it's good enough for me. 2 weeks ago in the New York Times magazine, there was an article about Dr. Christopher Kerr, a hospice doctor, who began to do research on near-death visions. He was astounded when he discovered how often it happened, and how always it seemed to bring healing, hope, or consolation, and a greater acceptance of the dying process. Now, he gave a TED talk about this, and he did other talks before medical groups. And all the doctors skeptically shake their head and demand scientific proof. And all the nurses nod their heads because they've seen it. I saw one estimate that as much as one half of the population has some kind of experience of this kind. Could be we're surrounded by experiences that may be God incognito. I admit I'd prefer if it could be proved. But I'll go with it. If some dreams, visions, and fortunate coincidences are a glimpse of God, then those disciples back then had the all-time glimpse. Huddled in a small room, despairing, grieving, trying to figure out, what do you do after your life falls apart? And then a stranger appears among them. And as he begins to talk, they realize it's not a stranger. He appeared again and again and again, we're told, and each time brought the gifts of resurrecting love. Some kind of movement from death to life, from despair to hope, from grief to consolation, from helplessness to empowerment. It was Jesus. Could not be, not in the world of sight and experiments and what we know. It couldn't be, and yet it was. Unless, of course, as they were accused when they went out preaching, of being drunk. But they claim not. They became the joyful and powerful preachers and healers we heard about in today's first lesson. Complete transformation. They were resurrected. Maybe, writes Buechner, my friend really did come to me in my dream, and the thread was his sign to me that he had. Maybe it's true that by God's grace the dead are given back their lives again, and that the doctrine of the resurrection is not just a doctrine. If we affirm Jesus Christ and the fullness of God, then we've got to be open to the fact that God may become present to us in hidden or not so hidden ways. In fact, I would argue that resurrecting love, is the very way God is and will be in the world. Resurrection is ubiquitous as a green blade rising from the ground in this season, surrounding us. A degraded forest regenerates. Resurrection. Forgiveness is offered and received. Resurrection. Wounds heal. Resurrection. A gentleman who meets us at Mustard Seed Ministry accepted a cup of coffee, and then he asked Francisco to offer a prayer for his deceased friend. And the man was consoled. That's resurrection. 3 Afghani women come to this country, and they're helped to a new life in a new world. Resurrection. Bread and wine become the presence of Christ with us. Resurrection. Resurrection is the love of God working throughout time and space, from the time of the Big Bang to that final day proclaimed in today's second lesson. The resurrecting love of God gathers up all things in Christ, things in heavens and things on earth, all into Christ. Resurrection surrounds you and I every day. But for whatever perverse reason, and maybe it's fear, or maybe it's just the part of us that loves to see My WAPO, that's the Washington Post, for digital feed, I looked, and the first anxious or depressed or angry. But there was the seventh one that talked, and this is their words, about the resurrection of a dead lake in Death Valley and the glorious bloom of flowers. 1 out of 7. Patty and I get the Week magazine. It's this compendium of everything that kind of happened during the week. 6 of the first 7 articles are about things that would depress you, make you angry or sad. And then they do have this little panel down at the bottom, and it says it wasn't all bad. Little vignettes of feel-good things. Given all that, I'd like to piggyback on Jen's sermon last week. You may remember she suggested that for the remaining days of Easter until end of May, whenever it is, that you practice an Easter discipline, and she suggested some form of prayer. So I want to piggyback that and suggest an Easter discipline to you. That at some point in the day, and probably later is better than earlier, you just take a few minutes and think about the day and ask yourself, today did I see God's resurrecting love at work? The gift of hope, consolation, or empowerment, or life. Maybe it made your news feed that day and you saw it there. Maybe you observed it. Maybe you were blessed enough to be the recipient. Or maybe even more wonderful, you were the agent of resurrecting love. So take that moment to acknowledge those happenings, and then take another moment to offer thanks and to taste gratitude. There are only 2 ways, Albert Einstein once said, to live your life. One is nothing is a miracle. The other is to see that everything is a miracle. There's a lot more to life than we begin to imagine.